Good morning, and my name is John Russia. I'm the moderator for this plenary, Panel 2. Welcome to the 8th edition of Infrastructure Africa. This panel is going to be discussing the topic, restoring economic growth, connecting African countries and optimizing the AfCFTA. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will constitute the world's largest free trade area, with the objective to realize a continent-wide single market for goods and services, with free movement of business, persons, and investments. The AfCFTA has the potential to reignite industrialization and lay the foundation for the continent's integration into the global economy as a significant participant. In order to render the AfCFTA successful, developing a robust infrastructure and streamlining regulatory framework is an imperative. An integral component of rebalancing global trade relations to level the playing field for African businesses, enabling them to operate in a large-scale market unbridled by regulatory fragmentation. This is the topic that we are going to be discussing today, and joining me to deliberate on this very important matter, particularly if one considers that the starting of trade of the FTA commenced on the 1st of January 2021. And so far, it appears that negotiations are proceeding quite well to finalize everything before the end of this year. I am joined by three distinguished panel members. I will later allow them to introduce themselves, but I'll start with Mr. Louis Yao Aful. Mr. Louis Yao Aful is a trade practitioner with specialties in private sector development and international trade. He's as an executive director of AfCFTA Policy Network Group. He leads the largest international free trade think tank. Louis holds all qualifications in the social sciences with specialty in private sector. Louis was also a member of the consultative team in the AfCFTA draft process, the rapporteur on private sector, a member of the technical working group on AfCFTA by the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Ghana. He serves on several national and international boards. Louis, thank you very much for joining us and welcome. We look forward to listening to your wonderful insights. Thank you. Our next panel member is Dr. Marcus Steele. He is the President region responsible for the African region at Robert Bosch. He has been with the Bosch Group since 2014. He is responsible for Bosch business in Africa. Before co-founding Bosch Global Venture Arm as Managing Director in 2007, Marcus worked as a Vice President of Bosch Global Corporate Strategy Department. He has a distinguished career and also long-standing with a number of international companies. He holds a university degree in mathematics and physics, including a doctorate summa cum laude from University Sorbonne from Paris in France. He is fluent in English, German, and French, and has a good working knowledge of several other languages. He is a member of the board of German African Business Association, a member of the Senior Council and chairman of the Training and Education Committee of Southern African German Chamber of Commerce. He is also vice chairman of the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers, as well as advisory board member of various other institutions and associations involved with promoting economical, business, and skills development in Africa. Dr. Marcus Steele, welcome, and you may say good morning to our participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and a very good morning to all the participants.
Thank you, Marcus. Our next panel member is Ms. Marcela Hlapo. She is the Chief Executive Officer of African Rail Industry Association. She has over 20 years of experience in manufacturing and technical business development and is currently the CEO for the African Rail Industry Association, a rail industry body with the objective of promoting and protecting the common interest of persons, companies, and organizations within or associated with the railway industry. This includes creating and harnessing centers of expertise in areas of model choice and integration, such as railway safety, education and training, policy, environmental issues, and information and communication. She started a career as a quality control manager at Protect Galvanizers, was later headhunted by Stocco Engineering, and has also represented an Italian company accent, and further. Marcella holds a BCom in marketing and NLB from UNISA with various training certificates from the Institute of Directors. She also has a certificate in the art and science of negotiation skills from the University of Witwatersrand. Marcella, welcome and thank you for joining this distinguished panel.
Good morning, John, and good morning to the rest of the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just like to request all the participants, those who have joined us, I also want to welcome you and thank you for once again for participating at this wonderful event. It has become really one of those great events that we look forward to every year. For those who are participating, if you have any questions, please do not forget to write down your questions on the chat box, and we will make sure that your questions are answered and that you leave this meeting satisfied with the responses that you are getting. Panel members, as we have said, the AfCFTA started trading on the 1st of January, and we all know, and it has been spoken almost consistently, almost every day, that it's going to become or is a game changer for the African continent. As individuals with different backgrounds, because I see here an industry association representative, I see a business representative executive, and also I see a person with a non-public or private sector background, including previously with government, but was very intricately involved in the negotiations process around AfTA. So I would like to start with Louis and then perhaps go to Marcella and ultimately end with Marcus, just to come in a very short 1-2 minutes, give us your perspective on the AfCFTA, from where you're sitting, why do you think it is important, and what do you think are the key pillars or elements that government need to tackle in order to make its implementation extremely successful? We'll start with Louis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I've been trying to finally get my virtual background. Well, I think it will be a bit different, but it's almost the same. So from the question you asked me about my perspective, I think that the African Continental Free Trade is the best offer after the WTO to enable African markets to have access to one another. Is the best opportunity perspective in the area of intra-African trade, boosting intra-African trade. We know that we have not performed well when it comes to trading among ourselves in terms of continental-wise or regional-wise. And we've been around 16% compared to other Asian and other African, other world economies or regions that are trading massively among themselves. Then again, my perspective, I think that is important because at the end of the day, when we are able to have one standardization and certification of our products, uniform harmonization of our product being registered, it will enable exports that have been rejected because of certain quote unquote technical barriers to be redirected to the markets of Africa. And so it's good for governments because at the end of the day, this is a strategic opening of your economies through kind of manufacturing and industrialization agenda. It is also imperative because at the end of the day, AfCFTA is not going now. It forms part of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, which is trying to integrate the markets, integrate Africa, so that after one market, we're going to one custom union. Then from one custom union, we're going to have one currency, one central bank, and then one passport. So it is an agenda that is going to go steadily. Again, I would like to express the fact that the continental free trade is not just about trading goods, it's trading services, competition policy, investment, intellectual property rights, e-commerce, and all these things, all these protocols is a huge area that can open up the sectoral development of the African economies. Finally, I also like to express the fact that if you even take the trading services, services contribute about close to about 49 to 50% of GDP, which has not been tapped yet in Africa. And the World Bank estimate that it will grow very big by 2025. Now, what it means is that at the end of the day, you have about 12 sectors of the economy that have not been liberalized. There are about 12 sectors under trade in services that have not been liberalized. And that is very, very important that under the continental free trade, the economies that are struggling to really liberalize these sectors will have the opportunity to have the chance to develop those sectors. So it's not just about an agreement, it is a world creation part that governments need to take opportunity of and really integrate and really implement within their jurisdictions. That's my initial comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Marcella, I mean, from an industry perspective, and I think part of this debate here, the next sentence in our topic is connecting African economies and optimizing the FCFTA. With the railway sector, as you know, people looking at it as one of the critical components to really enable and ensure the successful implementation of the FCA. What is the industry perspective? What is the sentiment you're getting from industries, the excitement, but also what are some of the challenges that you think need to be addressed in order to make this effective? Marcella.
Thank you, John. I think we are living in exciting times as Africans, and we have no any other opportunity than the present. And we are also fortunate to have a guiding document, or rather a guide from the African Union 2063. And I take special mention of where it talks about the integration of the continent, where we should have a world-class infrastructure. And I think we as private sector need to play a significant role in bringing about the integration of the sector. But what is also equally important, where African Union 2063 agenda provides that the development of the continent must rely on the potential of African people, particularly its youth and women. Now, going back into the CFTA is an instrument that would then bring about the visions that we're looking for from an African perspective. And also to point out that as an industry body, we are no longer considering ourselves as a South African body, but rather an African body. We can no longer continue being separated as Africans. In order for us to achieve the maximum benefits out of CFTA, we have to work together. We have to see this continent as integrated. Now, the railway sector has to play an important role. We need to move away where the road plays a 90% in terms of transporting goods and people. We need to make sure that we become efficient as Africa. We need to make sure that we are able to control our own economy. We need to further ensure that we are able to eradicate poverty. Now, that also goes together with AU 2063, CFTA, opening up the economy of Africa. But most importantly for me, in wrapping up, is that private sector participation should be key in terms of developing. Private sector is positioning themselves to be implementing partners to ensure that CFTA is implementable immediately for the benefit of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. Dr. Marcus Steele, representing Bosch, obviously, but I think business perspective in general. And I know of the very important role you're playing in the automotive sector. But ultimately, the FCFTA will stand or fall on the back of what business also does in order to capitalize on the opportunities that it's creating. What are business perspectives in this regard? And what do you think, or your views around what are the must that governments must do to actually make this agreement effective and to attract private sector to become excited about it and to become the driver for the implementation of this, rather than just standing by and waiting for governments to to create a more favorable environment, because I think that it's like a two-track process that needs to unfold over the course of years. So what are your perspectives in this regard?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and I'll rephrase it a little bit maybe, and I'll take this perspective now. Bosch is a very diverse company, also with my second hat as the Vice President of the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. So I'll take the automotive industry as an example, and actually would say that government and private sector need to work closely together to make an automotive industry in Africa happen. And what do I mean by that? The African automotive industry hardly exists today. I mean, we have some automotive industry in South Africa with roughly 600 vehicles produced per year. We have some automotive industry in Morocco with a similar amount produced, and then there's a little bit in Egypt, and then there's hardly anything anywhere else. And we also have little local value add and localization, so we are lacking the jobs in Africa to actually also not only then assemble the vehicles that are used later, but we are essentially the users, and someone else or some other regions in the world are producing them, or even worse, that we in Africa actually get the used cars. And there's one African president who's once called Africa the junkyard of the world, which is then obviously something that we want to change also as the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. And that is a matter of scale. And that's where the AFCTA actually comes in, because there's no single country in Africa, not even South Africa or Egypt or Morocco, which is actually big enough to sustain an automotive industry on its own. And today we are already with Morocco or South Africa with 600,000 vehicles, almost subscale. And now with an internal combustion engine, normally in the automotive industry, we are talking about 1 to 1.5 million vehicles, which would need to be produced, let's say, regionally. So not only in one country, but also in neighboring countries or countries participating in a distributed value chain. And if we are going to the electrical paradigm, where we have a completely different type of powertrain, we might even need 2 million vehicles produced locally, regionally, to actually have a globally competitive automotive value chain. So, and just to say again, I mean, automotive industry, there's just been a CNN session where a lot of OEMs have been part, also we as AAAM being part, which actually exhibits exactly all of that very well. Which shows that there's a lot of spillover effects, but huge amount of jobs. If we're thinking about the millions of jobs which are dependent on 15 million vehicles produced in Europe, if we say that in Africa it is much less automated, much more manual, we could have probably at least 15 million jobs directly employed in the automotive value chain. Multiply that by 5, the indirect jobs and logistics infrastructure that we are talking about here today, plus the financial services and all the rest, we have 75 million. Then we multiply that by 5, the household, so we can possibly even let's say provide the food and the livelihoods of 1/3 of the African population by creating an automotive industry. And that's where again the AFCTA comes in, because as I just mentioned, there's not a single country in Africa which can actually sustain an automotive industry. And there's lots of challenges to tackle, and that's the question that you have actually asked. It's harmonization of automotive policies. And I'm very pleased to say that now South Africa and Ghana have started to work on that together. We are trying to create now a coalition of the willing between the likes of Morocco and Egypt and Ghana and East African countries. That's why I'm actually currently in Tanzania to meet the president on Friday with AAAM delegation to talk about collaboration as part of AFCTA. We're working with Wamkele Mene of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, because it's about the harmonization of automotive policies, it's about fuel quality, homologization, and many, many other things. And just now to take the point why infrastructure is actually so important, they just give you the example of Europe, and that was a big thing in the Brexit negotiations, because there's so many automotive parts which finally end up in the final assembly of a BMW or Volkswagen or Renault, Nissan, you name it, is somewhere in Europe, but it crossed the channel at least 6 times on the way to be built into a vehicle. So crossing borders, being able within Europe, within 24 hours or 48 hours to be anywhere in Europe, so that you can have, and we have in the automotive value chain, you have the final assembly, which is the OEM, like a Nissan or a Toyota or whoever. Then you have the tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers like Bosch. Then we have tier 3 suppliers, tier 4 suppliers, tier 5 suppliers. And again, to make it very concrete and plastic, I'll just give you the example what my dream would be, for example, if we're talking the southern African region in terms of also infrastructure, what we would need to have windscreen wiper systems produced in Africa for Africa in South Africa, for argument's sake, if I take that example, could take the same example in West Africa, East Africa, or in the north. We have the copper belt where, for example, you get the copper out of in Zambia, then you need to refine the copper, you need to have it automotive made into automotive grade, then you need to do the copper wires, then you need to put it into electromagnetic magnets. Let me take as an example what we could do in Africa with a proper infrastructure in terms of border crossing, very fast border crossing, roads, highways, rails, a port, etc., what we could do. And let me take the example of windscreen wiper system that would, in the end, in the current system, be put into an assembly plant, for example, of a Nissan Roslin or BMW in Roslin. We have copper in the copper belt in Zambia. That could be then separated the copper into a proper copper and automotive grade, whether in Zambia, Botswana, or in a neighboring country, Zimbabwe. That could go into a tier 4 that would do automotive grade copper wires, which would then go into another tier 2, tier 3 supplier, which would do an magnets with the copper wiring, which would go into a windscreen wiper motor, which would go into a Bosch plant for a windscreen wiper system, which would then end up in a plant, in an assembly plant of a Nissan, BMW, Daimler, Toyota, Volkswagen in South Africa, or for that argument's sake, now I took South Africa as an example. But a key topic for that also is that the infrastructure needs to be in place, and we can talk about that later, that sometimes now infrastructure is and the logistics costs are so prohibitively expensive in Africa to actually transport one small device from one place to another, that actually that would also be a tackle to actually establish this automotive industry in Africa. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm sure that we can talk about that in more detail and what that means for infrastructure later.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm very grateful on the approach or the experience that you have shared, what's happening with the automotive sector. I think that's a model that perhaps, and I want to go to Marcella here, to understand, because Marcus ended up talking about infrastructure. Rail is one of the key components of the infrastructure space in the continent. What lessons do you think you could learn from the automotive, the approach that the automotive industry is taking, particularly if you consider that one of the decisions of the African Union was for South Africa to champion the establishment of rolling stock manufacturing hub in the continent, and how do you think the FCFTA can help you as an industry to actually realize that objective? Is there conversation taking place amongst the members of the industry? But how do we ensure cross-fertilization of ideas between your sector and what the automotive sector is actually doing, so that you can then customize and adopt a similar approach? Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think as a railway sector, we can draw a lot from the automotive sector. But having said that, I think your OEM from the automotive sector are largely multinationals, and then therefore they will have one uniform standard that is applicable across, say, perhaps most OEMs. What we find as a challenge in Africa is that although we are meant to be a hub for rail rolling stock manufacturing, standards become an issue. We have American standards, we have EU standards, we have standards all over. And until we have an African standards, we're then able to achieve the manufacturing of a rail rolling stock, whether it's components and partnering with your multinationals. And my view is that standards largely excludes African and manufacturers, and that is a big challenge. We have international or multinationals that are manufacturing locally, but we still continue to see a huge portion of those contracts being imported. I mean, a full product being imported, and then therefore excluding the industry. And the automotive sector, we know that they've invested a lot locally to bring up local companies, and they're further investing, according to the information that I have, it's about 8 billion rand or so to develop small businesses. But I also think that automotive international market, particularly those that come into the continent and manufacture here, it's not only about building clinics. I think we need to create sustainable jobs that are actually beneficial to Africans, that will ensure that Africans contribute meaningfully to the African economy. Yes, we can learn a lot from them, but we need to be equal partners. There is a lot to learn from international market. Currently, John, we're talking about third-party access into the main network of Transnet. I mean, Dr. Till, we would absolutely love to learn from Deutsche Bahn. How did they manage to move from a monopolistic type of environment to an environment that they have today? We're currently working on a study like that, practical implementation. Then by having private sector participation, that in itself will decrease the transportation costs that you're referring to. And we know that Africa is expensive when it comes to logistics, but increased competition, bring more private sector participation, that will then bring the cost down. And in my view, John, is that once you get increased private sector participation, then you will boost the manufacturing sector of the continent. Already we are seeing that companies such as Unitrans consider the trucking, whether the trucking and road sector as having reached their maximum capacity. Last week, they started going to the rail space. They transported their first cargo, and that in turn, their rolling stock were purchased from a local manufacturer. So policies that we put in place have a significant benefit for the manufacturing sector, and working with our OEMs that are prepared to truly invest locally is going to be key.
Thank you, Ms. Helen. I think the points around the question of standards is extremely important. One of the key elements of the FCFJ is around the rules of origin as well. And I think oftentimes what we see is that thresholds are defined, but very little is done in terms of specifications of standards of different goods. Because when you talk about it, if you're also talking about processed foods or whatever, the question of labeling and other elements also come into the fore. Let me go to Louis, perhaps. Louis, you sort of also straddling between the three elements that are critical to make the FCFTA work, given your experience and background and the role you played in drafting. I just want you to share with the audience what were some of the sentiments and insights that you obtained by being involved in that process. What are some of the key barriers that you think need to be overcome? And here, I'm not just talking about the policy issues, the regulatory issues, but also I'm talking about sentiments. What are the nuances underlying all of this that will make collaboration and working together and integration much more effective? And I'll then go to Dr. Marcus still, because I like the approach that they are taking, because here is private sector, tackle the bull by the horn and is driving the process, also identifying what are the measures. Louis, what was your experience and what would you like to share with this audience so that as countries begin to negotiate at a bilateral level, I can also, being a South African, look at Ghana and say, I have to put myself in the shoe of Ghana and allow Ghanaians to also put themselves in my shoes so that we can reach a common understanding. Can you share your insights?
I think that I would like to also emphasize that in the infrastructure side, companies like TAC are trying to come on the market. We are ready to build speed trains across the African markets, taking opportunity of AFCFT. I'm representing their interest here. TAC is focused on speed trains. I think they have signed MOUs with some countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and they are still moving in. Now, I think that the African Continental Free Trade seems not to have really reached the understanding peak yet. Because if you produce the goods, how would the goods go? So transport is key to the Continental Free Trade. And it's a practical barrier, because if the goods are produced and it does not get to the markets, it is as bad as not even having it at all. And how would you boost intra-African trade? when again, you even talk about areas where, in terms of intangible goods, logistics, services infrastructure, how are they going to get to the people? And so in the component of the continental free trade, there is what we call the BIAT, the boosting of intra-African trade. And one of the pillars is trade-related infrastructure. Trade-related infrastructure. It is imperative upon government to commit budgets, allocations for the development of infrastructure in their respective countries to allow the smooth running of the agreements. That is very, very key. One of the key barriers that people, we envisage is that of the barrier of, in terms of payment systems. There was this difficulty of payment systems, because if we are going to have to trade among ourselves and everybody's having a kind of currency, different currencies in various values, in various exchange rates, how are we going to have it? So I think that latter part of it came on what we call the Pan-African payment system, which the heads of states work closely with Afrexim Bank to develop what we call the Pan-African payment system, which now is in force at the pilot stages. Wherever you are in your respective countries, you can pay to another supplier in their own currency and still not have a problem with it. So payment system was an issue. And that is, again, the second other issue. We're going to have harmonization of registration and certification of products. You know, we are looking at boosting intra-African trade. How are we going to accept this product as an after product? Currently, the difficulty that is going on is that if you can go, let's say if you come to Ghana, yeah, we have the normal exportable product that we used to have, but most people do not know the difference between an after product and a non-after product. And so there's the need for us to look at closely that side to have also one harmonized registration and certification of goods, so that when a product is moving to Nigeria, Nigeria recognizes it. Nigeria is moving from Nigeria to South Africa, is the same heading, the same harmonization, besides the rules of origin. Thank God that the ASU, the Africa Registration Organization for Registration, which is building that harmonization, is on course. Another major hurdle that everybody foresaw, and which is still a difficulty, is most of the trade associations or trade institutions that are supposed to be part of the implementation process of AFTA, most of them do not know the tariff concessions that must be published. It's because if the tariff concessions are not known to these associations and traders and private sector, how will they be able to take advantage of any market intelligence, let alone have access to the markets? For example, how would I know that in South Africa, these are the goods you have liberalized? How would I know that in Ghana, these are the goods you have liberalized? If you don't know the goods that your fellow neighbor or fellow member state have liberalized, it'd be difficult to even make the first step of thinking of exporting or importing. And so it is imperative that these associations, these private sector, all of them should be encouraged, should be taken into capacity building, open up to understand the tariff offers. And not just that, it should be published in what was envisaged called the Africa Trade Observatory. The Africa Trade Observatory currently, even though it has started, it's not actively well implemented. The Africa Trade Observatory is the website where all countries who are members are supposed to publish their tariff concessions and also publish any changes that goes on in their liberalized regime. A critical example was when a company in Ghana exported product to South Africa. It was a very difficult time for the company. About 3 weeks before, there was issues at the customs. I'll come to that barrier. The next major barrier is the custom cooperation. The agreement said there will be a custom management and cooperation. Unfortunately, I would have wished that this continental free trade agreement would have gone to one custom union at the same time, because custom unions, cooperation is not the same as custom union. We are managing it. And so we are going to visit the problem where you will go to one country, you see things done differently. You go to another country, things are done differently, especially with respect to after goods. Some customs do not even know which products are African after products. Some do not know whether they are supposed to charge tariffs on supposed to charge tariff on some of these products. Some of them don't even know the certificate after certificates of origin, and so forth and so on. So there is the need for the customs cooperation. There's a need for capacity building for their staffs or recruitment or what do you call it, officers at various custom entry points to know and to be able to play part in the implementation strategy. These are very, very important areas that we need to actually look at, and this was envisaged. I'm glad that gradually, I will say that it will take about a year and a half more for us to really get some of these barriers actually off the table in beds. Finally, if you permit me, another great area that have been left out is the media participation. The media participation, you see, the media has been left to be reported. No, but if you look at the agreement itself, the media, that is the fourth state or fourth estate, are part of the agreement under trading services. They are supposed to bring all various annexes, all various institutions, all various together through information. And so it's not like they are supposed to be putting up information when we're having programs or we're having conferences. No, the media professional bodies are part and supposed to be integrated in the process. This is very, very important, because if you and I should say, most of the activities that we are doing,
now, please.
Thank you. Most of the activities that you and I are doing involve some of these institutions, and some of these institutions see themselves as isolated from the agreement, whereas they are integrated part of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And I think you made some very pertinent points around the question of harmonization, broadly speaking, because it's well known that the major barrier is not tariff barriers, but the non-tariff barriers are really where we have a lot of problems that are hampering higher levels of inter-Africa trade. I want to come back to the main topic of really this conference, which is around infrastructure. And I want to go to Dr. Marcus Steele, because you mentioned Europe and the importance of moving goods and services in a very short space of time at very cost-effective prices from one point of Europe to another, because that's what the FCFTA is trying to enable. One of the big arguments I think that people always raise when it comes to Africa is the fact that the continent is too big. From the tip of South Africa to the tip of North Africa, it's almost 11,000 kilometers. From east to west, you're also talking almost 6,000 kilometers. But the truth is, when you look at Europe, as that broadly speaking, the 27 member states, there are also places where the distance from one point to another are as long as 9,000 kilometers and 6,000 kilometers, also traversing a number of countries from one point to another. How has Europe managed to do it, and what should Africa learn from that experience? I'm talking about infrastructure to bring together different countries, independent sovereign states, but having their railway systems interconnected, having their road systems interconnected, plus the airlines and maritime industry and the whole logistics setup really geared towards fulfilling this objective.
I would like to give 4 concrete examples regarding borders, then 3 very concrete examples regarding infrastructure, and then maybe 2 general remarks or the consequences of that what we currently see in Africa. So the first thing that I would say, one thing that needs to happen, and that's also the experience from Europe, one needs to digitize borders to increase the productivity at the border crossings. So first is obviously the harmonization of custom systems in Africa, and we are, for example, involved with the OECD also to help African customs authorities to do that, because currently today we have massive paperwork at the border, and that obviously clogs up and leads to a lot of traffic jams at the border. The second topic, again, at border crossings, most border facilities, gates and truck waiting areas are not big enough today. So there needs to be extensions everywhere. It would be very good even if both countries at the border would do that as a joint project to increase the efficiency on both border sides. That's also one thing that one could learn from Europe again. A third thing is border crossings in the long term ideally there should be a kind of green light approach at the border, so that the trucks and the shipments would already be pre-checked at the departure facility, then the data uploaded to the customs system. So then the truck would more or less drive through the border gate and getting scanned, weight, seal reading, etc., etc. So everything is all above board, and this data would then get compared with the data at the customs system, and everything is okay. Then the truck can cross the border, and that more or less minimizes the whole border crossing to a few minutes. Fourth and last point regarding borders, and that's very much seaports. Today, lots of container ports, they really have to improve their processes and the equipment. Sometimes it takes weeks or months for us to clear a container in many ports across the whole African continent. It gets it from the port. And then the time is also not really predictable. And that has obviously impact on the inventory management at our warehouse, because we need to increase safety stocks, which again increase the amount of working capital, increase the final price to the customer, and obviously then also more cost for the consumer. So that's the 4 points regarding the border. Three very concrete topics also again regarding infrastructure. Again, one topic regarding digitalization. And we need a very strong 4G or 5G telecom network, at least across along the most important roads in Africa, to be able to trick the shipments, but also for security reasons. For example, when we would know when the truck stops, or we would have CCTV on the truck to make sure that there's no security incidents, and for that we need this type of telecom network. The second aspect in terms of infrastructure is the road condition in many countries is very poor, and that obviously then slows down the truck, and that again needs to increase in costs. And ideally also large cities should have bypass roads, as we have them in other parts in the world, to reduce the lead time of getting from A to B. And the last topic, and we already touched upon that, is the railway. So the railway infrastructure, and I know here in the ESC, they're working on the central corridor, the southern corridor, the northern corridor, to get from the coast as far as Zambia or the east of the Congo. I know that, let's say, toward the south, we have the railway projects to get actually from Zambia or the east of the Congo, either to Walvis Bay, to Durban, or to Maputo. And obviously all of this, that would be extremely good alternatives to sea freight. And my pet example is that, I mean, it's maybe now a little bit exaggerated, that it's faster and cheaper to ship a container from Lagos to Accra via Rotterdam or Antwerp or Hamburg than it is from directly from Lagos to Accra. And or even faster than shipping it via the road, which is only a few hundred kilometers, actually, because the average speed in Africa today of a truck is 40 kilometers per hour or less. So it's not a matter of that there is a matter of speed limit, but it's waiting times at the border, the road quality, the traffic jams. And another pet example that I have is that now we have some OEMs, automotive OEMs, who produce in South Africa, then ship a completely knocked down kit to somewhere, for example, in East Africa, and the whole production in South Africa, including all of the purchase of the products which might come even from Thailand or from Mexico, that is the same price and the logistics costs of shipping that CKD kit from South Africa to Rwanda, Uganda, or somewhere else in East Africa. And if we don't get these logistics costs and the infrastructure costs down, then we will not have these distributed value chains that the automotive industry needs, so that we can have large enough markets that everyone buys in. Then it's a win-win for all the African countries to participate in the distributed value chain that I've been talking about that we have in Europe.
Once again, I just want to remind all the participants, those who are following us, this discussion, if you have a question, you have a comment, you want to raise something that you'd like the panelists to answer to, please just send us a message on the chat box, and we will make sure that those issues are addressed. Masela, let me come to you. I mean, we heard about infrastructure, and when the railway system is key, is vital. And I think it's not for lack of volumes or cargo to move, but I think something is happening that is preventing the private sector to play a much more effective role in the development of Africa's railway system. If we're looking at Southern Africa and we take the North-South corridor, 98% of the goods moved along that corridor is by road. that puts an additional pressure on the road system. And if we look just at that corridor as well, the emergence or the development of mega mining projects in the Copper Belt, in Zambia, in the DRC, and that indicates very clearly that the cargoes are there to justify and make a business case for investment in rail. Why is that not happening when rail has such a critical role to play from South to North Africa? So what is it that needs to be done by governments, but also industry? And if we take the lesson from the automotive sector, where they organized themselves, their competitors, but they came together, they created an industry association such as yourselves and began to work with, let me call it a coalition of the willing to create a critical mass and begin to get traction. Just help us to understand what is it that still needs to be done to make the private sector in the railway industry to play the leadership role that it should.
Thanks, John. I think historically, particularly from the South African point of view, and us having one of the largest, over 77,000 rail tracks, we as a rail sector, we're largely working in silos. And I think with a strong and powerful rail body like ourselves, we are changing that. Funding is a big problem, and that is also impacted by policy certainty. No business wants to invest in an environment where there is certainty, where there's no certainty. And I think that's some of the problems that we have, particularly on the railway side. But that could be overcome with policy development and proper choosing your partners that you're going to work with that are in it for the long run. And we need, as Africans, to fund our own development. If we don't do that, we've seen that we will get loans, and those loans actually do not work in our best interest. So we need to find structural reform around the way that we tend to do things. And for us as South African, and perhaps other countries such as Tanzania, have been allowing third-party access onto the main network. So currently, we are at a point where our state president has announced that we will have third-party access onto the core network. Now, that immediately unlocks huge benefits. One, it unlocks investment. We already have few nations and private sector financiers that are knocking on the doors that want to know when is third-party access going to be implemented and actioned. So the president has given himself 12 months to achieve that. Now that in turn, the structural reform that needs to take place, not only in South Africa, but to the region in general, that is going to increase intra-Africa trade, and particularly on the regional basis, before we even attempt to go on to the rest of the continent. But it's also important that when we talk about borders and then the 40 kilometer of an average speed of a truck, isn't it time that as a continent that we implement our strategy from road to rail? Isn't it time that we reduce the number of trucks on the road and then move to rail? And I think there's no better time than the present to reduce the inefficiencies that are provided by road. We need to move as much as possible to rail, and that also, it benefits third-party access, it benefits private sector, it benefits the manufacturing sector. So all this, the greater participation of private sector to resolve some of the issues where there is lack of private sector participation could be resolved through structural reform, policy certainty. The AU talks about silencing the guns, and so the more peaceful Africa we have, the greater the benefit for our continent. And then we're also going to see an increased investment that will see all these projects unfolding, and then therefore having an industry that will work with the willing, as you referred to. The only way that we're going to work together, one Africa, one market, but also working together, similar to what the automotive has managed to achieve.
Thank you, Marcella. And I think yet again some very pertinent points. And I think as we now move towards really summing up this conversation, I wanted us to really, and I'll start with Louis, be really very practical in the next course of action, coming up with very concrete recommendations on what needs to be done. Louis, my question to you is the following. Even though we see a huge drive and excitement around the implementation of the FCFTA and the role that infrastructure should play in enabling that, the fact of the matter is that we are still seeing a considerable amount of nationalism creeping into the discussion, particularly with the adoption of a series of import substitution measures and prohibitions that are still being put in place in some parts. And within that framework, how do you see what needs to be done to deposit more confidence on other countries, such that we can start looking at what we stand to gain and what we can benefit, and make sure that we all work together towards achievement of that? And again, I want to go back to the automotive industry example, because I think Marcus shared some very fantastic data on what the benefits would be. How do you think, if we were to undertake some kind of economic benefit analysis, the World Bank has attempted to do something around the distributive and economic effects of the FCFTA? How is that in any way going to change the narrative and the debate and the sentiments at national level, just based on your experience?
Thank you. It's important for us to understand that when African economies put trade barriers among themselves, they lose more than when other economies put trade barriers before them. Therefore, it is for our good that we continue to let our nationalism and national policies be rather integrated into the continental policies or framework. Having said that, it is imperative for us to understand that investment is not about only Africa and the 9 partnership agreements with third-party countries. No, those third-party countries are supposed to also make sure that whatever concessions are given to them will be given to the same member state, because it's a preferential treatment. Again, I would like to also push for that. There's the need and time now to have infrastructural financing banks or institutions, because it is very important. It is also important to have joint ventures. For example, Ghana decided to end its railway at the north, but there is now the Trans-ECOWAS rail program, whereby it will continue beyond Ghana to Burkina Faso. So with the continental free trade, as I mentioned, a company like TAC, they are trying to do their best to take the intra-capital infrastructure speed train. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire can engage in a joint venture in the area of that rail investment. So infrastructure has now gone beyond just a nationalist approach to a continental one. And finally, if you take Ethiopian Airlines were trying to get into contact with many African countries to have a 60-40 approach. So I will urge that at the end of the day, the agreement is holistic. Let us approach it holistically. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis, for raising those points. I'll go back to Marcus. Marcus, as we begin to sum up and looking at your particular initiative, what is the outlook like and what's the way forward? And I know you have already touched on some of the things that must be done to enable that value chain to be established and become efficient and really functional in the continent. If today, what do you think governments need to do? Because in order for that to happen, to establish that automotive sector between and value chain across Africa, linking South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, and Morocco and Egypt, the logistics network and supply chains between those countries need to be fixed? What's the current status, and what are the practical interventions that need to be undertaken by these countries to ensure that it becomes a reality? And which are the key sectors from railroad, air, and whatever that needs to be tackled going forward? Thank you. To support your
Yeah, thank you very much again for this question. I would like to introduce two more examples that I have from European Union, and that is actually when all these Eastern European countries joined the European Union, but even already in the 1970s and 1980s, when the Mediterranean countries joined. And I think that is something maybe for the African Union to look at, or the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Obviously, I'm not a politician. I'm not sure how much that is feasible. And I also know that it was extremely controversial on the European Union level, and maybe only also all of the history of Second World War and all the devastation that they brought over the European continent really was the argument and the driver behind this. So fortunately, we don't have a war in Africa, but on the other hand, to build this industry, we have some industrialized or at least semi-industrialized nations like South Africa or Egypt and Morocco and many other ones which are not so industrialized. So there was a mechanism in Europe which was called the Cohesion Fund, where in which each European Union member state actually put money in, and depending on their economic strength, and then it was distributed actually to in particular to make these border crossings happen, or to put a high-speed railroad into Italy or into Spain to actually enable all of this participation in the European value chain. And then later, that was obviously in the 70s and the 80s, the Mediterranean countries, and later the Eastern European countries. So a cohesion fund in terms of which is dedicated 80% only to put, let's say, all these challenges regarding borders and infrastructure out of the way. That is one element. And the second element that is also another additional fund, which has more to do with exchanges between experts between the countries, respectively upskilling. So the whole topic about, if we want to talk about distributed value chain, and now again, I'm not only talking about the mechatronic engineers that one might need in the automotive industry, we need as many logistics experts, we need as many people who really can build long-lasting railway structures, port structures, and all these other things in place. And if that could be coordinated, just like it was in the European Union, by a system like Erasmus, where students are exchange programs and many of these other things, so that there's also skills transfer even within Africa. So that is something, two very concrete topics that I think the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, as well as possibly the European Union. As I said, I'm not an African politician, so I don't really know which mechanism would work best. But I'm sure that all of the automotive industry participants would participate in trying to enable these mechanisms actually in the end to work. In particular, if we are talking about skills initiatives, but also in terms of really saying, in our experience, whether it's ASEAN or whether it's Europe, digitalization of border crossing, enabling extremely efficient customs operations, that is what we know from other parts of the world, and that's what should also be happening in Africa.
Thank you. Marcus, I just have a question on both the mechanism, the funding mechanism you spoke about. Were they government funded funds, or were they PPPs?
Only government funds, single and only government funds. I'm not sure whether in the end the projects were PPPs. There were some, also in particular in infrastructure, some PPPs in Europe work and some others are a disaster. So I'm not sure what would work in Africa, but it was essentially, if you want to transfer of funds of more of richer countries in Europe to poorer countries in Europe. And in the end, the idea was, in the end, everyone will benefit. Just as my co-panelist has said, that we really need to convince, I mean, we first, as we always say in the automotive industry, we first need to bake the pie, and then we can distribute the slices, and the various governments can fight about how large the slice should be that they would want from the cake. But if everyone starts to fight about the slice first and we have no cake, then no one will get to eat the slice.
Thank you, Marcus. I agree with you. We need to bake the pie and then decide. Marcella, just back to you again. When we look at the railway network in the continent, and then whether you're looking south, west, eastern Africa, North Africa, the gaps in the network are huge. Sometimes even problems nationally. How do you think we'll overcome these gaps when we are talking about intra-Africa trade and we are also talking about interconnecting regions? Let me say SADC with East Africa, and considering the problems that you spoke about, standards, about certification, about the specs of the tracks, whether it's Cape gauge or standard gauge, and all the mixed parts that are thrown into the equation. What are some of the practical solutions that you are deliberating on, or I think you should be deliberating on, looking at yourselves as an industry that you can put forward before governments to help them to address some of these matters?
Thanks, John, for the question. Some of the solutions low-hanging fruit, and some of the solutions perhaps are a little bit complicated. So what the pandemic COVID has taught us is that we need to start with what we have. What we have now, from the infrastructure point of view, we have over, say, 80,000 kilometers and largely standard gauge. And we also have a huge rail rolling stock that is largely Cape gauge. Now, before we even go to what the AU has recommended, we need to use what we have. We have Cape gauge, we have assets that are worth billions that from the SADC perspective, we will stay on Cape gauge as much as we can because of the huge investment that we've made as a country and the region. And from the standards point of view, it becomes a challenge because there are areas where there is a significant Chinese investment and the standards there are different. And there are areas where there's a significant European Union investment and the standards are different. And then you have different standards body, for an example, your UIC that have their own standards and not necessarily engaging the African industry in terms of finding practical ways. But what we find is that such organizations are talking to themselves and trying to somehow impose their standards on Africans. That Africa is gone. The new Africa that is led by the youth will not be participating in such. We need to find standards that work for the entire continent that does not necessarily exclude. So the gaps, yes, are there, but how do we start closing them? Open to third-party participation, meaning that will actually increase government's revenues because we are of the view that we must be having a willing, we are willing participants in this user pay principle. Two, we know that railways has reduced greenhouse gases. That is a benefit to the industry. Investment will definitely increase. We have today few companies that are knocking on the door saying, we want to invest in Africa. We want to invest in this country because we see the huge potential. And those companies are not necessarily multinationals, the African companies that want to reinvest their monies into the sector. Competitiveness, driving prices down, and also then improving employment levels. Last week, the employment levels for South Africa came out. They don't look good, but in order for us to turn that around, to close the gaps in terms of developing where we don't have infrastructure. So on the infrastructure side, that's where the investment needs to come in. But in order to save African governments, certain portion of their fiscus, can we separate the two, the rail rolling stock and the infrastructure? Now with rail rolling stock, we can, as the UNECA has advised African states that we need to rectify the Luxembourg Rail Protocol to the Cape Town Convention as to make funding of rolling stock cheaper and easier to obtain, and then therefore actually reducing the cost of having the infrastructure. So that gap, changing the laws, it does not cost us much. It will cost us maybe as little as possible, but the impact is huge. Structural reform costs us little, but the impact is huge. But I would also like to point out, perhaps invite the likes of Dr. Till, that you have an automotive sector, suppliers that you have developed. There is no reason absolutely why those same suppliers should not be manufacturing for the railway sector. We talk about the wipers, there's a wiping system in the railway sector. So there's interconnectivity in terms of manufacturing, automotive, railway sector is all technology. John, lastly, through DTIC, we were lucky to be in Germany and we visited the VW factory, largely robotic with few individuals. Then a question came from one of the delegation that, did you have to retrench to put the robots in place? He says, no, we actually increase our staff turnover by 15%. Now, it goes back to the quality of education. It goes back to what we invest in our youth, because that's where the future employee is going to come from. So all these multinationals, when they invest in the country, they need to take education and proper skill transfer as a very important ingredient in terms of developing Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. I think we're going to start wrapping up. Just want an indication from Charles. I want to give you really one last point to raise, because whatever we talk about infrastructure development to support and enable the implementation of the FCFT, everything ultimately will boil down to financing. And when we look at the data and we look at who is financing Africa's infrastructure, it's largely dominated by African public sector government. The second biggest funder is China. They are then followed by a number of DFIs, including such as the African Development Bank, World Bank, and I think the Japanese as well, and then followed by the EU institutions and America and others. But private sector financing of infrastructure is extremely low. When I look at the last numbers over the first 5 years, it's been hovering around the margins of 2%. What is it that still needs to be done? And how can private sector play the leading role in coming up with solutions that it can put on the table to governments to finance and support some of this infrastructure development? Bearing in mind that the big argument also is the fact that many of these projects are just ideas. They are not backed by bankable feasibility studies. Considering all of these things, what in your view, for your particular industry, how are you addressing this dichotomy of having a good potential, good opportunity, but no resources to actually kickstart the whole process as well? What solutions do we put on the table before government so that our treasury departments can begin to consider that? And if we were going to look at what Marcus shared with us around what Europe did, around the cohesion fund, it was simply governments that really put forward that initial seed funding to kickstart the process. What are your views financing of infrastructure development in Africa, the role that private sector should and can play, and why is it not doing so far?
Thank you very much for that question, John. I personally believe, and I mentioned that there's some public-private sector project that I know from Europe and elsewhere which have been successful. Some other ones have been a complete disaster. And at least from what I know, governments taking the lead in terms of infrastructure, whether it is rail, ports, or others, and possibly later having private sector operate these, whether it's in the port or airports or other things, that might make a lot of sense. I'm just very hesitant to say that the private sector, in terms of also bringing financing in and then doing the business case, should take a leading role in putting the infrastructure in place. As I said, as an operator, I've seen that work, but as someone who's proposing a project, financing the project until the end of the lifetime of the project, I so far am struggling seeing something that I could say has been something broadly successful around the world.
Thank you, Marcus. Louis?
Well, I think that it's not a bad idea, but if you look at countries like Ghana, we have come out with what we call the PPA, the Public-Private Act, or the PPP, Public-Private Partnership Act, whereby now governments feel that it is time to partner the private sector, especially when it comes to projects and project financing, by extension, infrastructure. So now, if gone are the days when they felt that, look, the public sector always have to lead the way, they felt that it's now time for private sector to be given that 50-50 opportunity. So for me, I think that it is important that governments come out with an act of parliament that will give the opportunity for public and private participation moving forward. And then again, there's also the need for them to have a lot of infrastructure levies that will be able to support constructing, new constructions, repairing, and what have you, and new investments in the area of infrastructure and logistics. So that should be one of the ways to go. And then we should also be able to accept the continental approach, whereby institutions such as the African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank are poised to support internal investment banks to be able to undertake infrastructure development. This will be my take. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Marcella?
The future looks bright for the continent. To enable funding from private sector, as mentioned earlier, policy certainty, and enabling environment for private sector. Having said that, African governments do not have money, and we need active private sector participation. Private sector cannot wait on the side and wait for projects to be ready. If we want to invest on the continent, we need to be active participants. As an industry body, we're currently conducting a practical implementation into third-party access, and we are funding that. So if we don't fund that, if we don't see ourselves as implementing partners and supporting governments, we will never grow this economy. There'll never be a bankable project. So we need to work with government, take the lead where we can in support of government. We need to make sure that Africa works for Africans through private sector participation. Competitiveness will be achieved. Elevation of intra-Africa trade will be achieved. Improving the continent's economic competitiveness will be achieved. We will build a huge export capacity and industry development all in all. So private sector participation is not a nice to have, it's a must, but we must work with governments in order to achieve the ideals of the African Union and to implement CFTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. I think I'm gonna ask you to make some of your closing remark, but just to once again thank all of you, all the panelists, for your sharing with us your insight, your perspectives, and I think some of the points made may have enlightened those who are involved in policy and decision making, for them to take that into consideration as well. But as we begin to really wrap up, and perhaps there are viewers out there, participants, who are a little bit pessimistic about the FCFTA because they have seen similar initiatives before, that came up with a lot of strength, but then began to lose steam. Based on the practical work that you are doing on the ground, the three of you, and the experiences you have gained, what should you tell to those people that still need a little bit of convincing to say that this is what we are doing practically, and this is the results we are achieving, and this is what we think we are going to be achieving over the next couple of days, and to throw in the challenge to everybody else to say, if we want to restore economic growth in the continent, we want to interconnect, we want to create the scales, the economies of scale that Marcus referred to, if we want to ensure this regional economic development and integration really happens, it simply means that all of us have to really put our hands to the plow, and nobody should be spectators. What should you tell to those individuals or institutions that are still on the sidelines as to why they should get involved, and what are the benefits that they all stand to gain, and the continent overall and the population through our specific involvement? So I just want you to touch on that, and then we are going to sum up. I want to thank you. Thank you. I'll start with Marcus. I'll go to Marcella, and Louis will then sum up for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for that question. I mean, for me, the key topic is actually what we have started to do as the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers, and that is to get together a coalition of the willing of some African governments who already want to kickstart that. And by the way, that is also the experience that we have in some other part in the world, where sometimes you just need, not for example in the European Union, the 27 member states, but you need 3, 4, 5 really powerful ones, which are also not necessarily only the powerful ones, but let's say a handful of countries who want to make a start, and then they show that it works, and then everyone else, or not, or then at least a majority or many others then follow. So our approach would now be, and I can only say that so far, collaboration with the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, with African Union, with Afreximbank is excellent. It is a huge task that we are faced with looking at integrated value chain across countries in Africa, and will certainly take time. But for the time being, I'm very optimistic that there is a significant number of governments who've sharing our vision and who want to work with us. And then if the private sector and the public sector, so the governments or certain governments, can move forward together with other of these facilitators, as I mentioned, as a secretariat or these development banks, then I'm very confident then we can make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Louis?
As Africans, we cannot afford to abdicate our responsibility of developing the continent and our own countries to other people. So we need to take we need to be active participants in our economy. And having said that, the multinationals that become active participants in Africa, they have to, and absolutely have to, treat Africans as partners, not as employees that need to be temporarily employed and be given as little as possible, but also amongst ourselves as Africans. I cannot, as South Africa, and bank on the fact that I have been declared to be the hub of the rail rolling stock manufacturing. It can be. We need to share our skills with our brothers and sisters on the continent. We cannot develop our own. We need to share those skills. We need to make sure that each and every one of us we are able to empower each other in order to bring about the CFTA, increase intra-Africa trade. It can only take place through us. So those that don't believe in this vision, they will be left behind with nothing to say but to complain. Active participation, Africans, active participation of multinational, treating Africans as equal partners will be key in getting the continent where it needs to be. Thank you.
I would like to wrap by saying that removing tariffs, trade tariffs among ourselves is far more better than not. And again, the international or the third-party countries, in terms of having trade barriers with us, is less costly than when we put the trade barriers among ourselves. So we need to remove the trade barriers. Secondly, our institutions must know now that the world has moved beyond the stage of raw materials into value chains. And we have all the raw materials in Africa. It is time for us to participate in this manufacturing and industrialization agenda, which the Continental Free Trade is pushing for. Finally, in terms of infrastructure, when you produce the goods, it will not go if we don't have a good transport and logistics system. And it begs on us to commit levies and finance our own self-sufficiency, just as we have been doing for our roads. This time we need to just increase the percentage of our levies, road levies, rail levies, so that we'll be able to put up serious infrastructure in energy, road, rail, aviation, and maritime. We can do it because that is what we have been doing all this while. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panelists, Dr. Marcus Steele, Vice President of Bosch. Thank you very much. Louis, Executive Director of the FTA Network. Hallelujah. And also to Marcela Nhlapo, the CEO of the Africa Railway Industry. Thank you very much for joining us today, and all the participants who have been following us. We thank you for sharing your views with us. And I think, as we have heard, the work is just beginning. It is just starting. I mean, the starting of trade is not the end of it all. There is still substantial amount of work that needs to be done. I think both by government, private sector, and everybody else involved that wishes to benefit from this. And I think the work that lies ahead of us will require a greater level of consistency and commitment, but also deployment of significant resources, both technical and financial, to ensure that the goals enshrined in the AFCFTA, but also underpinned by the broader Agenda 2063 are realized. And if we all recognize and accept that as a fact, then we will be able to really come up with multi-year programs or actions or interventions that will, in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, bring Africa closer together. And I want to conclude with one very important remark, and that is one of the reasons why many initiatives, laudable ones such as these ones, have failed in the continent or not really delivered the results that we all expected, was simply because we were not consistent in our commitment in pursuing those objectives. We gave up pretty quickly because for one reason or another we became frustrated. But I think if we change that perspective and all of us commit and understand that this is a long-term project that we'll still continue to be working on 10, 20 years, 30 years down the line. And we are just really the pioneers that have to kickstart and kick this ball into the field so that the game can begin. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the best, and see you certainly next year when we shall have another Infrastructure Africa event. Thank you very much.